Miles Harper had always been a man who liked his peace and quiet. His ranch, tucked away on the outskirts of town, was more than just a piece of land to him. It was home. For years he'd lived there with nothing but the sound of birds chirping in the morning and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. It was simple, predictable, and exactly how he liked it. Miles spent most days tending to his horses, fixing fences, or watching the sunset from his porch. Life was good, but all that changed one summer when a new subdivision popped up right next door. The developers had cleared acres of open fields to make way for cookie-cutter houses with manicured lawns. At first, Miles didn't think much of it. Sure, the construction noise was annoying, but once the dust settled, he figured the new neighbors would keep to themselves. Boy, was he wrong. Enter Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Karen wasn't your average neighbor. She prided herself on being too involved, some might say. Whether it was policing mailbox colors, enforcing strict landscaping rules, or sending passive-aggressive notes about lawn ornaments, Karen made sure everyone knew she was watching. And if you stepped out of line, well, let's just say she wasn't. Shy about making her displeasure known. At first, Miles tried to avoid any run-ins with Karen. He kept to himself, minding his own business while she busied herself micromanaging the subdivision. But little did he know, trouble was brewing, and it was headed straight for his backyard. It started innocently enough. One sunny Saturday morning, Miles was out checking the perimeter of his property, making sure everything was secure. As he walked along the fence line near where his ranch met the subdivision, something caught his eye. There, smack dab in the middle of his fence, stood a brand new wooden gate. It looked freshly painted, complete with shiny hinges and a little sign that read, "Shared Access Approved by HOA." Miles blinked a few times, thinking maybe he was imagining things. But no, it was real. Someone had built a gate into his ranch, without so much as a heads-up. Furious but trying to stay calm, Miles marched over to Karen's house, determined to get answers. When Karen answered the door, she greeted him with a smug smile like she'd been expecting him. Without missing a beat, she launched into an explanation about how the HOA board had approved the gate for community access needs. She talked about fostering neighborly connections and creating pathways between properties. To her, it sounded perfectly reasonable, even noble, but Miles wasn't buying it. He explained firmly that his land wasn't part of their subdivision and certainly wasn't subject to their rules. This was private property, plain and simple. Karen listened with feigned interest, nodding occasionally, but it was clear she wasn't backing down. When Miles finished speaking, she gave him a dismissive wave and said, "I'm sorry you feel that way," before slamming the door in his face. Standing there on her porch, Miles felt a mix of anger and disbelief bubbling inside him. How could someone just waltz onto his property and put up a gate like it was no big deal? And what kind of person thought they could override basic respect for boundaries because of some HOA nonsense? As he drove back to his ranch, Miles' mind raced with possibilities. He could call the authorities, file a complaint, or try reasoning with the HOA board again. But deep down, he knew those options wouldn't solve anything. People like Karen thrived on bureaucracy and red tape. They'd drag things out forever. Leaving him stuck in limbo. No, Miles realized he needed a different approach. Something unexpected. Something bold. If Karen wanted access to his ranch so badly, he'd give her something far more permanent than a flimsy wooden gate. An idea began to form in his head, growing clearer with each passing mile. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Miles had a plan, and it was going to leave Karen speechless. That night, under the cover of darkness, Miles got to work. He called up an old buddy who owed him a favor, a retired contractor named Jake. Together, they gathered materials from Miles' barn and started building. Bricks were stacked, mortar was mixed, and layer by layer, a solid wall began to rise. Where the gate used to be, it wasn't just functional. It was a statement, a message written in stone. This was his land, and no amount of entitlement could change that dot by sunrise. The transformation was complete. Where the wooden gate had once stood, now towered an imposing brick wall, 8 feet high and impossible to ignore. Embedded within it, almost comically, was the original gate, its hinges frozen in place. Useless against the unyielding masonry surrounding it, Miles stepped back to admire their handiwork. He couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it. Oh, what would Karen do when she saw this? Would she scream? Cry? Call the cops? Whatever her reaction, one thing was certain. She'd never see him coming. And with that thought, Miles poured himself a cup of coffee and settled onto his porch, ready to watch the fireworks unfold. Miles wasn't the kind of guy to sit around and wait for trouble to come knocking. He had spent his life solving problems with his own 2 hands, whether it was fixing a broken tractor or mending a fence after a storm. So when he decided to build that brick wall, it wasn't just about making a point. It was about taking control of the situation in a way that felt right to him. He knew Karen would never back down easily, but he also knew she hadn't bargained for someone like him. The night before, as Miles and Jake worked under the stars, there was a quiet satisfaction in every brick they laid. The rhythmic clinking of trowels against buckets, the smell of wet mortar, and the flicker of work lights created an almost meditative atmosphere. It wasn't just construction, it was a declaration. Every layer of bricks added weight not just to the wall itself, but to the message it carried. This wasn't just about stopping Karen's gate from being used. It was about drawing a line in the sand, loud and clear dot. When morning came, the ranch looked different. The new brick wall stood tall and proud, cutting off the subdivisions. Encroachment into Miles' property. The sight of it gave him a strange sense of peace. For the first time since this whole mess started, he felt like he was ahead of the game instead of scrambling to catch up. Miles wasn't naive. He knew. Karen wouldn't take this lying down. She was the type of person who thrived on conflict, the kind who saw any challenge as a personal insult. Still, he couldn't help but grin at the thought of her reaction. He imagined her walking out onto her porch, coffee cup in hand, only to stop dead in her tracks when she saw what had happened overnight. That mental image alone made all the late-night labor worth it. Sure enough, not long after sunrise, Miles heard the sound of hurried footsteps crunching across gravel. He didn't even need to look up from his porch to know who it was. Karen stormed toward him, her face red with fury, pointing dramatically at the wall like it was some sort of crime scene. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shrill enough to scare the birds out of the nearby trees. Miles leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee casually, like he didn't have a care in the world. "Morning," he said with a smirk. "Nice day, isn't it?" Karen practically vibrated with anger. "You can't just do this. This is outrageous. You've destroyed shared community property." Miles raised an eyebrow. "Funny thing about shared community property, last I checked, my land isn't part of your community. And even if it were, I don't recall anyone asking me if I wanted to share." Karen sputtered, clearly unprepared for his calm demeanor. "This is unacceptable. I'll have you reported. There are rules, you know." "Oh, I'm sure there are," Miles replied, setting his coffee mug down on the railing. "But here's the thing I checked. My property lines are solid, and this wall doesn't break any laws. In fact, it might even improve the view from your side." He gestured toward the sleek, sturdy structure. "You're welcome." Karen opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, realizing she had no comeback. Instead, she jabbed a finger in his direction. "You haven't heard the last of this," she hissed before spinning on her heel and marching back to her house. Miles watched her go, shaking his head. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, he'd won the first round. And honestly, it felt good. Better than good, actually. It felt empowering. Over the next few days, things stayed eerily quiet. Too quiet, if you asked Miles. Normally, Karen would have been pounding on his door or sending angry emails to the HOA board by now. But instead, there was radio silence. At first, he wondered if maybe she'd finally backed off. But deep down, he knew better. Karen wasn't the type to give up without a fight. Whatever she was planning, it was bound to be bigger and more dramatic than anything she'd tried before. Meanwhile, word of the mysterious brick wall began to spread. Neighbors from the subdivision started showing up at the edge of Miles' property, craning their necks to get a better look. Some whispered among themselves, clearly intrigued by the sudden appearance of such a bold structure. Others snapped photos with their phones, probably planning to post them online. A couple of kids even climbed onto a nearby fence to get a bird's-eye view, giggling as they pointed at the trapped wooden gate embedded in the wall. One afternoon, a man from the subdivision approached Miles while he was working on his tractor. "Hey, sorry to bother you," the guy said hesitantly. "But, what's the deal with that wall?" Miles wiped his greasy hands on a rag and shrugged. "Just keeping things tidy," he replied nonchalantly. The man chuckled nervously. "Tidy, huh? Well, I'll say one thing, it's definitely got people talking." That was putting it mildly. By the end of the week, the story of the brick wall had taken on a life of its own. Rumors circulated through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some claimed Miles had built it to keep out trespassers. Others speculated it was a statement against the HOA's growing influence. A few conspiracy theorists even suggested it was hiding something secret, a bunker, perhaps, or alien technology. Miles found the whole thing amusing, though he didn't bother correcting anyone. Let them think what they wanted. As far as he was concerned, the truth was simple. The wall was there to protect his land. Plain and simple. But while the neighbors gossiped, Karen was busy plotting her next move. She couldn't let Miles get away with this, not without consequences. Over the weekend, flyers began appearing on mailboxes throughout the subdivision. Printed in bold letters, they accused Miles of being a disruptive neighbor who refused to cooperate with the HOA. They called him unreasonable, difficult, and downright hostile. The flyers urged residents to join Karen in demanding justice and restoring order to the community. At first, Miles ignored the flyers. He figured most people would see them for what they were, desperate attempts to stir up drama. But then things started escalating. Anonymous complaints about noise and dust poured into the local zoning office, forcing inspectors to visit Miles' property multiple times. Each time, they left empty-handed, unable to find any violations. Still, the constant scrutiny wore on him. He could feel the pressure mounting, like a storm cloud hovering overhead. Despite the chaos, Miles refused to back down. If anything, the backlash only strengthened his resolve. He decided to take matters into his own hands once again, but this time he wasn't going to play defense. He was going on the offensive. Late one evening, Miles sat down at his kitchen table with a notebook and pen. He jotted down ideas, sketching out a plan to turn the tables on Karen and the HOA. First, he reached out to a reporter from the local newspaper, explaining the situation and offering to share his side of the story. Then, he dug up copies of his property deeds and zoning permits, preparing to present them as evidence in case things went further. Finally, he drafted a letter to the HOA board, politely but firmly reminding them that his land was not and never had been part of their jurisdiction. By the time he finished, Miles felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, not just for himself, but for anyone else who might find themselves bullied by people like Karen. The brick wall had been the first step. Now, it was time to show everyone that sometimes the best way to handle a problem is to meet it head-on and with style. As he turned off the lights and headed to bed, Miles allowed himself a small smile. Tomorrow was another day, and he was ready for whatever came next. The battle between Miles and Karen was far from over. If anything, it had only just begun. What started as a simple dispute over a gate had turned into a full-blown war of wills. With both sides determined to come out on top, Miles knew Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly, but he also knew she was running out of options. She couldn't argue with the law. The wall was legal. His property lines were clear, and there was nothing shady about what he'd done. So instead, she decided to fight dirty. Karen's first move was to rally her troops, or rather, her neighbors. She called an emergency meeting of the HOA board, inviting everyone in the subdivision to attend. Flyers were posted on every mailbox. Emails flooded inboxes, and even a banner was hung across the entrance to the neighborhood reading, "Protect our community." The message was clear. This wasn't just about one man and his ranch anymore. It was about them versus him. Miles heard about the meeting through the grapevine. At first, he thought about ignoring it altogether. After all, why waste his time arguing with people who didn't understand the situation? But then he realized something important. If he stayed silent, Karen would control the narrative. She'd paint him as the villain, twisting facts until even the most reasonable people doubted his side of the story. No, if Miles wanted to win this fight, he needed to show up not just for himself, but for anyone who might be watching and wondering who to believe. So, on the evening of the meeting, Miles walked into the community center where the HOA held their gatherings. The room buzzed with tension. Neighbors whispered amongst themselves, casting curious glances at Miles as he took a seat near the back. Karen stood at the front of the room, flanked by members of the HOA board. She looked smug, like she already knew how this was going to end. When the meeting began, Karen launched into her usual spiel. She talked about the importance of community, the need for cooperation, and the supposed chaos Miles had caused by building the wall. Her voice dripped with emotion as she described how his actions had disrupted the harmony of the neighborhood. To drive her point home, she pulled out blown-up photos of the brick wall, pointing dramatically at the trapped wooden gate. "This is vandalism," she declared, her voice rising. "It's selfish, it's destructive, and it has no place here." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding along while others exchanged uneasy looks. A few brave souls raised their hands to ask questions, but most seemed content to let Karen do the talking. It was clear she had them eating out of the palm of her hand, or so she thought. When it was finally Miles' turn to speak, he stood up slowly, taking a moment to scan the room. He didn't look angry or defensive. Instead, he appeared calm and composed, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Clearing his throat, he began to tell his side of the story. "I bought this ranch years ago because I wanted a place where I could live in peace," he said, his voice steady. "I've worked hard to maintain it, to keep it safe and secure. Then one day, without warning, someone decides they can just build a gate onto my property. No permission, no discussion, nothing. That gate wasn't about community access. It was about disregarding my rights as a property owner." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Now, I could have gone to court, filed complaints, or tried to reason with the OA, but honestly, I didn't think any of that would work. So I did what made sense to me. I built a wall. Not to cause trouble, but to protect what's mine. And guess what? That wall is perfectly legal. My property lines are solid, and I followed every rule when I put it up. As Miles spoke, the mood in the room shifted. Some people nodded in understanding, while others looked conflicted. Even a few of Karen's closest allies seemed unsure of what to think. For the first time, cracks were appearing in her carefully constructed facade, but Karen wasn't ready to give up yet. When Miles finished speaking, she jumped to her feet, firing off accusations left and right. She accused him of being unreasonable, of trying to isolate himself from the community, of causing unnecessary drama. She even brought up old rumors, hinting that Miles might have ulterior motives for building the wall. At one point, she turned to the audience and pleaded, "We're all neighbors here. Don't we deserve respect? Don't we deserve honesty?" Her tone was desperate, almost pleading, as if she was clinging to the last shred of support she had left. Miles listened patiently, letting her rant herself out. When she finally ran out of steam, he stepped forward again. "Respect works both ways," he said simply. "If you want respect, start by respecting other people's boundaries. Until then, this wall stays right where it is." The room erupted into murmurs once more, but this time the energy felt different. People weren't blindly siding with Karen anymore. They were thinking, questioning, weighing the facts for themselves. And that's exactly what Miles had hoped for. After the meeting ended, several neighbors approached Miles to thank him for sharing his perspective. One woman admitted she hadn't realized the gate had been built without his permission. Another man confessed he'd always found Karen's tactics a bit overbearing. Even a couple of HOA board members lingered behind to shake Miles' hand, acknowledging that his argument held weight. Of course, not everyone was swayed. Some still sided with Karen, accusing Miles of being stubborn or uncooperative. But for the first time since this whole mess started, Miles felt like he had allies. More importantly, he felt like he'd planted a seed of doubt in the minds of those who mattered most, the people caught in the middle. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood simmered but didn't boil over. Karen continued her campaign against Miles, plastering more flyers around the subdivision and sending angry emails to anyone who would listen. But her efforts felt hollow now, like a dog barking at a storm cloud. Without the full backing of the community, her threats carried less weight than before. Meanwhile, Miles kept going about his life as usual. He tended to his horses, repaired fences, and enjoyed quiet evenings on his porch. Occasionally, he'd catch sight of Karen glaring at him from across the fence line, her arms crossed and her jaw tight. But he didn't let it bother him. He'd already proven his point, and deep down, they both knew it. One afternoon, a delivery truck pulled into Miles' driveway, carrying stacks of heavy-duty steel panels. Curious neighbors gathered to watch as workers unloaded the materials and began installing them along the base of the brick wall. By the end of the day, the structure looked stronger than ever, reinforced with sleek metal that gleamed in the sunlight. When Karen saw the upgrades, she nearly exploded. She stormed over to Miles' house, demanding to know what he was up to now. "What is this? Are you trying to provoke me?" she shrieked, her face turning an alarming shade other. Karen's reaction to the steel reinforcements on the wall was exactly what Miles had expected: loud, dramatic, and completely over the top. She marched across her lawn like a soldier heading into battle, her face red and her fists clenched. When she reached Miles' driveway, she didn't even bother with pleasantries. "What is this?" she demanded, pointing at the gleaming metal panels now bolted securely along the base of the brick wall. "Are you trying to provoke me?" Miles, who had been leaning casually against his porch railing, raised an eyebrow. "Provoke you?" he said, feigning surprise. "I'm just making sure my property is secure." You know how it is once someone builds a gate without asking. You start thinking about all the other ways people might try to sneak in. Karen's jaw dropped, but no words came out. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at him like he'd grown a second head. Then, regaining her composure, she jabbed a finger in his direction. "This isn't over," she snapped. "You can't keep doing whatever you want. There are rules, and I'll make sure everyone knows you're breaking them." Miles shrugged, unfazed. "Knock yourself out," he said, tipping his hat as if dismissing her. He knew Karen's threats were empty at this point. The more she yelled and stomped around, the less intimidating she became. It was almost funny to watch, but Karen wasn't done yet. Over the next few days, she went into overdrive, determined to rally the neighborhood against Miles once and for all. Flyers appeared on mailboxes again, this time accusing him of escalating tensions and intimidating neighbors. She organized protests outside his property, leading small groups of supporters in chants that echoed through the otherwise peaceful countryside. One afternoon, she even set up a folding table near the edge of her yard, handing out flyers and urging passersby to sign a petition demanding the removal of the wall. At first, Miles found it amusing. Watching Karen scramble to drum up support was like watching a dog chase its tail. It was entertaining, but ultimately pointless. Most of the neighbors ignored her antics, rolling their eyes or shaking their heads as they passed by. Some even gave Miles friendly waves when Karen wasn't looking, silently showing where their sympathies lay. But as the days turned into weeks, Miles began to notice something unsettling. Not everyone was laughing it off. A handful of Karen's diehard followers started taking things too far. Anonymous notes showed up under his door, calling him names and warning him to back down. Someone spray-painted crude messages on the side of his barn one night, though the paint was easy enough to scrub off. Worst of all, late-night phone calls started coming in silent, menacing breaths on the other end of the line that left Miles feeling uneasy despite his outward calm. It wasn't fear that bothered him. It was the principle of the thing. These weren't legitimate disagreements anymore. This was harassment, plain and simple. And while Miles had always prided himself on handling problems quietly and respectfully, he realized he couldn't let this slide. If Karen and her crew thought they could intimidate him into submission, they were sorely mistaken. One evening, after another round of silent phone calls, Miles decided it was time to take action. He called up a reporter from the local newspaper, the same one he'd spoken to earlier in the conflict. This time, though, he came prepared. He handed over copies of his property deeds, photos of the original gate installed without permission, and screenshots of the hateful messages he'd received. He explained everything clearly and calmly, leaving no room for doubt about what had happened and who was truly at fault. The story hit the front page of the paper 2 days later, complete, with headlines like "Rancher versus HOA Queen, a tale of property rights and power struggles." The article painted a vivid picture of the escalating feud, quoting both Miles and several neutral neighbors who supported his stance. Photos of the brick wall, the trapped wooden gate, and the graffiti-covered barn accompanied the piece, driving home the absurdity of the situation. Within hours, the story had gone viral online, sparking heated debates across social media platforms. People loved it. Comment sections lit up with messages of support for Miles, many praising him for standing up to what they saw as petty tyranny. Memes featuring the brick wall popped up everywhere, turning it into an unlikely symbol of resistance against overbearing authority. Supporters even started a crowdfunding campaign to help Miles cover any potential legal fees, raising thousands of dollars in just a few days. Strangers sent letters and gifts, including a particularly memorable package containing a handmade quilt embroidered with the words "Property Rights Matter." Even local officials took notice. The county zoning office launched an investigation into Karen's actions, questioning whether her behavior constituted harassment. Meanwhile, the HOA board found itself under scrutiny, with residents demanding transparency about their decision-making process. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just fighting Miles, she was fighting an entire community that was starting to question her methods. For Miles, the sudden wave of support was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. He hadn't expected so many people to rally behind him, and it made him realize just how universal the issue of property rights really was. Everyone has boundaries they value, whether it's a backyard fence or a personal belief. Seeing others stand up for those principles alongside him reminded him why he'd fought so hard in the first place. Still, the victory wasn't without its challenges. As public pressure mounted, Karen grew increasingly desperate. She hired a lawyer to draft cease and desist letters, filed formal grievances with the county, and even attempted to organize counter-protests outside Miles' property. None of it worked. Her attempts to discredit him only backfired, making her look more unhinged with each passing day. By the time the HOA scheduled another meeting to address the growing controversy, the tide had clearly turned. Neighbors packed the community center, eager to hear what would happen next. Karen arrived flanked by her attorney, clutching stacks of documents and looking pale but determined. Miles, on the other hand, walked in alone, carrying nothing but a folder of evidence and a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. When the meeting began, Karen tried to reclaim control, launching into a rehearsed speech about fairness and accountability. But this time, the audience wasn't buying it. People interrupted her with questions, challenged her claims, and pointed out inconsistencies in her arguments. Even some of her closest allies seemed hesitant to speak up, sensing that the wind had shifted. When it was Miles' turn to present his case, he kept it short and to the point. He thanked everyone for listening, reiterated the facts of the situation, and reminded them that this wasn't about revenge or ego, it was about protecting basic rights. "We all want to live in peace," he said, his voice steady. "But peace doesn't mean giving in to bullying or ignoring the rules. It means respecting each other's boundaries and working together to find solutions." The applause that followed was deafening. For the first time in months, Miles felt a sense of closure, not because he'd crushed his opponent, but because he'd sparked a conversation that mattered. Whether or not Karen admitted defeat, the community had already moved on. As Miles drove home that night, he couldn't help but smile. The battle may have been exhausting, but it had also been worth every moment. His ranch was safe, his principles intact, and his faith in humanity restored. And as for Karen, well, she still glared at him from across the fence line, but her power was fading fast. The wall remained a testament to resilience, determination, and the importance of standing your ground when it matters most. The final showdown between Miles and Karen came not with a bang, but with a whimper. After months of escalating tension, public scrutiny, and endless drama, the conflict reached its climax during what was supposed to be a routine HOA meeting. But this wasn't just any gathering, it felt more like a courtroom trial, with neighbors lining up on both sides of the aisle, ready to hear the verdict. Karen arrived looking frazzled, clutching folders stuffed with papers and accompanied by her lawyer, a slick-talking man who seemed out of place in the small community center. He wore an expensive suit that screamed big city, while everyone else sported jeans and flannel shirts. The contrast didn't go unnoticed. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people exchanged skeptical glances. Some even joked quietly about how Karen must have drained her savings to hire someone so flashy. Miles, on the other hand, walked in alone, carrying nothing but a single folder containing his property deeds, zoning permits, and a few key documents. His demeanor was calm, almost casual, as if he'd already accepted whatever outcome awaited him. But those who knew Miles well could see the quiet determination in his eyes. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about principle. The meeting began with Karen's lawyer taking the floor. He launched into a polished speech, using complicated legal jargon and dramatic pauses to make his case sound ironclad. He accused Miles of being disruptive, unreasonable, and even dangerous to the neighborhood. At one point, he held up blown-up photos of the brick wall and the steel reinforcements, calling them aggressive acts of defiance designed to intimidate innocent homeowners. But instead of intimidating the audience, the lawyer's theatrics had the opposite effect. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging doubtful looks. One older woman leaned over to her husband and muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Sounds like he's trying too hard." Others nodded in agreement. Even some of Karen's supporters seemed uneasy, fidgeting with their notebooks or avoiding eye contact altogether. When it was Miles' turn to speak, he didn't waste time with grand gestures or fancy words. He simply stood up, cleared his throat, and started talking. "I'm not here to argue or cause trouble," he began, his voice steady and sincere. "I just want to explain why I did what I did and why I'll keep doing it if I have to." He went on to tell his story plainly, without embellishment. He explained how the gate appeared on his property without permission, how he tried reasoning with Karen only to be dismissed, and how building the wall was his way of protecting what belonged to him. He pulled out copies of his property deeds and zoning permits, laying them on the table for everyone to see. "This is my land," he said firmly, "and I'm not breaking any laws by defending it." As Miles spoke, the room grew quieter. You could have heard a pin drop. People listened intently, their expressions softening as they realized the truth behind his words. When he finished, there was a long pause before someone near the back clapped slowly. Then another person joined in, followed by another, until the entire room erupted into applause. It wasn't thunderous or overwhelming. It was respectful, heartfelt, and deeply human. Karen looked stunned. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she barely reacted. She glanced around the room, searching for all eyes, but found none. Even her closest supporters avoided her gaze, shifting awkwardly in their seats. For the first time, she seemed small, powerless, and utterly defeated. After a brief deliberation, the HOA board delivered its ruling. They acknowledged that Karen had overstepped her authority by approving the gate without consulting Miles or verifying property lines. They revoked the original approval, officially declaring the shared access point null and void. Furthermore, they issued a formal apology to Miles for the harassment he'd endured, promising to review their policies to prevent similar disputes in the future. When the announcement was made, the room erupted again, this time with cheers and whistles. People shook Miles' hand, patted him on the back, and thanked him for standing up for what was right. A few even apologized for doubting him earlier, admitting they'd been swayed by Karen's rhetoric. Miles accepted their gratitude graciously, smiling but staying humble. "It's not about me," he told them. "It's about all of us remembering to respect each other's boundaries." As for Karen, she slunk out of the meeting unnoticed, her head down and her shoulders hunched. She didn't say a word to anyone, not even her lawyer, who packed up his briefcase and left shortly after. Over the next few weeks, Karen became a ghost in the neighborhood. She stopped attending HOA meetings, avoided social gatherings, and kept mostly to herself. Occasionally, Miles would catch sight of her peeking out from behind her curtains, glaring at the brick wall like it was some kind of personal insult. But she never approached him again. With the conflict finally resolved, life on the ranch returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after such a whirlwind of events. The brick wall remained standing, stronger than ever thanks to the steel reinforcements. What had once been a source of contention had become a symbol of resilience and justice. Neighbors often stopped by to admire it, snapping photos or leaving notes of encouragement taped to the bricks. Some even brought gifts, a basket of fresh-baked cookies here, a jar of homemade jam there. Miles appreciated the kindness, though he insisted he didn't need anything more than peace and quiet. One day, a local artist showed up at his door with a proposal. She wanted to paint a mural on the wall, depicting scenes of rural life rolling hills, grazing cattle, and a golden sunset stretching across the horizon. "It'll turn the wall into something beautiful," she said, showing him sketches of her design. Miles hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to alter the structure that had come to mean so much to him. But eventually, he agreed, realizing it was a fitting tribute to everything he'd fought for. The mural transformed the wall overnight. Where once there had been plain red bricks, now vibrant colors danced under the sunlight. Children from the subdivision began visiting regularly, marveling at the artwork and asking Miles questions about his ranch. He welcomed them warmly, sharing stories about his horses and teaching them how to care for animals. Slowly but surely, the hostility that had divided the neighborhood melted away, replaced by curiosity and camaraderie. Months later, when a reporter came back to follow up on the story, Miles gave a simple answer when asked how he felt about everything that had happened. "It's funny," he said, leaning against the newly painted wall. "I never wanted any of this attention. All I wanted was to live my life in peace. But sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even if it means ruffling a few feathers, and honestly, I'm glad I did." The reporter smiled, jotting down his words. As she packed up her notebook and camera, she turned to take one last photo of the mural. In the distance, a group of kids laughed and played, their voices echoing across the open fields. Behind them, the brick wall stood tall and proud, no longer a barrier but a bridge, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, people can find common ground. For Miles, the battle may have ended, but the lessons lingered. He learned that standing your ground doesn't always mean fighting dirty. It means staying true to yourself and your values. He also discovered the power of community, not just in numbers, but in shared humanity. And perhaps most importantly, he realized that sometimes the strongest walls aren't built to keep people out. They're built to remind us of where we belong. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the ranch, Miles sat on his porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The world around him was quiet again, just the way he liked it. But this time, the silence felt different, not lonely, but peaceful. Somewhere deep inside, he knew he'd earned it.